Well, hello everyone here and watching at home virtually as well. My name is Rochelle Akufo. I'm the anchor for Yahoo Finance, and I have the pleasure of having with me here for this very interesting conversation Eloisa Domingo. She's the Vice President of Human Resources and Chief Inclusive Diversity and Equity Officer at the Allstate Corporation. So we're looking forward to this conversation about workforce diversity. So you have obviously a vast number of years of experience, more than 20 years of working in diversity. Talk a little bit about first how the conversation has changed over that time and how have you really seen that evolve?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks so much for having us here. You know, Rochelle, I wish I could say that it's changed a lot. You're right that I've been in this field for over 20 years. And for those of us who have been doing this work in this field, I'm sure you two are like, has it really changed? And that's kind of the sad-ish part of it, you know, that we're kind of constantly having these conversations. We're constantly saying, well, you know, why aren't we supporting our minority-owned businesses? Why don't we have, you know, kind of these great programs, you know, like the ones that we just heard? Why aren't we already thinking about these things as kind of legacy programs? You know, we had earlier our keynote speaker say, I kind of want to work myself out of a job. We've been saying that for years. Yet I still have a job, you know, which is good, right? My kids don't not want to let me have a job. But the point is, how have we actually integrated these into our practices so that the rubric is very easy, right? That it's not just the people who have diversity in our titles that we're pushing this. So, you know, while the one thing that has changed is things like this, having these conversations that are not tucked in, having these conversations that are public, having these conversations that are also part of public policy. That's one of the things that I think that has changed. The other things that have also changed is you've got marquee names like Allstate, like Ernst. You've got these marquee names here. In the past, marquee names wouldn't risk having these conversations on a main stage. We would say, like, I mean, we're kind of thinking, you know, about it. We're now taking a risk and saying we're not doing it great, but we're doing something. So that, I will say that has changed. We still have a long way to go, but those are some things I'm pretty proud of having changed.
Now, one of my favorite books is called Start With Why. And for a lot of companies, they sort of go out to sort of have these solutions perhaps without consulting their communities or without really understanding the core values of what's driving it. So as you look at things like inclusive diversity and equity as a core value of Allstate, how do you define that and how do you see that show up in things like company culture?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, some of the things that you've heard from the colleagues before me on this stage have been really, really amazing, you know, kind of things. Allow me to also kind of brag a little bit about where Allstate is. Two major things. And this is to answer your question about how do we actually see it involved in the culture. So, you know, it's one thing for a company to talk about hiring diversity, promoting diversity. That's always kind of been the core of diversity efforts for most companies. But when you talk about where you're putting your money, like where you're spending your money in a very consistent way, that's when a company really makes a difference. So at Allstate in 2020, we had a $1.2 billion bond deal, which was the largest of its kind, exclusively managed or comprised by minority-owned businesses, veteran, women-owned, minority-owned businesses. Again, the largest of its kind at that time, that was exclusively managed by minority groups. As a result of that, we've actually seen more companies do that in the amount of about 300% growth in support of those companies or those enterprises. One of the things that Allstate promised themselves, and this is one of the reasons I came to Allstate, is we promised ourselves that we would do better. We promised ourselves, we didn't promise anyone else, we promised ourselves that we would do better and that we would be bold. And so we did this in 2020, right? We didn't really know how it was gonna go, but we did it. And so that's the one thing about our culture, I think that's also really good. One of the other things too, to kind of piggyback on some of the colleagues that were just before me, you know, in the pandemic, a lot of people sold their properties because we all went hybrid. We all have offices at home. We don't really need to come into our office space. We're excited now to see one another. But in general, there's some percentage of our work that is hybrid, right? So then you've got all these real estate offices, or you've got your real estate. You're paying thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for, but you're really not using them. So Allstate, I'm sure, you know, you can drive around here, and we've got Allstate like agency buildings, right? Or like you see, like in the communities, you've got this little office space like right beside a vet or something like that. They're not being used, anymore. So what we're doing is we're offering them to our minority-owned businesses. And we're saying these can be your business centers, free of charge. You don't have to rent them. You don't have to use them. You can go in and use our space. We're not using them, right? Why don't we go in? And then we're also offering mentorships and things like that. If we can at least offer our real estate free of charge, that's something that we can do very easily. We're also talking about, I think many of you already know that Allstate, we kind of exclusively own the Sugar Bowl kind of branding. And so what we've been talking about is looking at Black-owned businesses and highlighting anywhere between 5 to 10 of them on the 50-yard line. Allstate doesn't need to be, the only one on there. Why don't we highlight and offer real estate space even at the Sugar Bowl and things like that? So there are some unique things that we're trying to do to really, like you said, Rochelle, change the culture.
And I love how intentional Allstate is being about this, having those sort of internal benchmarks, because a lot of us will see the external ones, the ones that the companies put on their websites, but we don't often get to hear about some of these behind-the-scenes conversations, which are very important. Another way that Allstate was in being proactive was in going before the House Committee on Financial Services. Something they proactively did, not subpoenaed. We know a lot of companies come, dragged kicking and screaming. Talk about your decision to do that and what you were hoping to achieve with that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So for those of you who don't know, the House Financial Services, they have a subcommittee on diversity and inclusion. They audited about 27 of the largest insurance companies in America under this review called the Review of Diversity and Inclusion at America's Largest Insurance Companies. So we were one of them, right? We ranked pretty well in the top 4th, which was great. We still have a lot of work to do. And about the 13 or 14 companies then received a letter asking them to join a hearing a couple weeks ago at Congress to talk about, how they did. All the companies said, no, thank you. And Allstate said, we'll do it. And we did not receive a letter, actually. We said, well, I heard that people were being invited. Why don't we go, And and it's funny because I know you all are like, why would you do that? Like, what? Because Congress is really hard. It was really hard to be there. And but we meaning HR, corporate brand, our government relations team, we had a conversation and we said, you know what? We're not doing the best, but we're not doing bad either. And we scored pretty well on the audit. And I think that we're at a place where we should be talking about this. We should be saying, you know what? Why don't we just push the conversation? We promised ourselves that we'd be bold. So why don't we go to Congress and say that we would, right? So we did. We were the only private company that showed up. There were 5 witnesses. The other 4 were trade associations. I got asked a question by everybody several times. It was really, really tough. But we were really proud because we lived into our own promise to say that, again, we're going to talk about it. We're going to expose, what we're not doing well and where we are doing well. We're going to stand in our own brand and say, listen, like we're really committed, And so that's why I think we did it. And don't get me wrong, this was a calibrated risk that we took. We do feel that it paid off in the end. We're really proud of ourselves for the way that we showed up. But it also pushes us to think, well, if we want to continue to do that, how should we actually make more change? And we also wanted to show the U.S. government, the Congress, the chamber, that Allstate is in this. We are in this. We are committed. We want to expose, a level of humility. And I think that's really important here as we're talking about this. Systemic bias, all of these biases, redlining is very real. And we live in all of the contemporary impact of that. So the biggest thing that we should do as companies, especially marquee names like Allstate, we should say, yeah, you know what, we were a part of it. Maybe not directly, but we were a part of it. So how can we also be a part of the solution?
And something that's important, obviously, for all companies is data, because sometimes when we have these conversations about diversity and inclusion, it becomes a nice to have, but as we've been hearing consistently, it's also a smart to have. And one of the things that came up in that hearing was about diversity data being a critical tool for companies. So how is Allstate using that data to really improve workplace diversity? And how key is that to accountability and sort of moving forward from there? If you all don't have scorecards already, I would really encourage you to have scorecards. Prior to my coming on to Allstate, we were kind of haphazardly looking at our data, haphazardly looking at the way that we were hiring, promoting, retaining,
people of color, women of color, LGBTQ veteran, all of these things. It was pretty haphazard at best. We did not have one corporate scorecard. We just didn't. We were also not transparent about our data. And so we changed that. We did two things. So one, we created what we call an IDE dashboard, Inclusive Diversity and Equity dashboard at Allstate. All of our HRBPs have access to this. Our directors and above all have access to this data. You can go in right now and say, as of this date, how is my hiring for women of color? How is my hiring for Hispanics? How is my hiring for this? And then you can use that data and have conversations, real-time conversations, right, about this. So that's number one. Our talent scorecards are offered monthly. Between the 5th and 10th of every month, our monthly scorecards around talent go out to all of our EVPs. They're business partners, and they are held accountable on a quarterly basis to say, okay, well, how did you actually do? While they get monthly scorecards, we talk about it as a company quarterly. So here's what happens about that. You know how most companies, all companies at least, you look at your checkbook monthly, right? So you're saying, where are we spending our money? How did we do? All this other stuff. We're elevating diversity data in that same way. So then the same way that you're looking at your money, you need to be looking at your people every single month. That's the elevation of the conversation. That's the elevation of consciousness. So it's not just the data and the governance of the data, but it's the use of the data, the messaging, of it. All of our employee resource groups, they also get access to the data to use that for their solutions. We don't want diversity data to be scary. Again, we govern it, of course, to maintain privacy and data excellence. But at the same time, we also don't want it to be so far away where, like you said, Rachel, people aren't actually using it.
Because that might be overwhelming for a company. If they do initially put out one of these scorecards and they see that perhaps they're falling a lot further short than they expected, how do they go from that point to then building best practices?
Yeah. A lot of it is, as I mentioned, just making sure that we're having these transparent conversations, but then also looking at the systems that might support, like you said, those deficits. I actually just had a conversation just this morning with our new talent management vice president, and we were looking at our succession planning, at our pipeline, and those kinds of things. The talent scorecards were a big part of that, and then to be able to say, well, where did we actually, fall short, and what systems preclude us from success or allow us to continue that level of failure or that level of a deficit. So at Allstate, we really do believe in how the systems are leading humans and how the systems will support appropriate and successful behavior. I wish I could say as a diversity person that we will change hearts and minds like this. It takes a long time to change hearts and minds. And so one of the things that you can do as a leader is to look at the systems that exist. How can you create more equitable systems so that people even learn through those systems and it eventually can impact more hearts and minds?
Now, something that we do see when it comes to whether or not the communities being served are reflected in some of the corporate boards or management positions, that pipeline. Talk about what you've seen in that space and what you'd like to see in terms of improvements from here.
Yeah. So, we're really proud at Allstate. We've got 54% of our overall employee population identify as racial or ethnic, female. 47% is racial or ethnically diverse. So pretty good numbers. 71% of our directors and above identify as either a female, a person of color, or as a woman of color. So that's good. But the thing is, those numbers, as I mentioned earlier, the 47 and the 52, a lot of our diversity is at our lower levels, right? So this is what happens at a lot of companies, especially predominantly white institutions, where you have great diversity numbers, but they're in kind of your independent contributor or your lower manager levels. To your point, Rochelle, if the diversity isn't in decision-making areas like our board, our officers, our C-suite level, then it doesn't really mirror the communities in which we live, work, and serve. For us, we find the X factor, like where a lot of our diversity at the lower levels, the higher that you go, the more white and male that it gets, and the older, like in terms of the generations it gets. We see that X happen right at about the manager or senior manager level. So that's what we're looking at right there. It's like, what happens there? Why do either people leave? Why are we not promoting? What are we not doing right? Where either we lose that or we're not promoting the appropriate, talent, or we're not developing, that talent. We do have a goal to match the communities in which we live, work, and serve. Right now, we're doing a really good job of our managers and below match the nation and match the market. We are a mass market corporation, but above, we don't match the nation. So we have to do a better job. And so again, having these transparent conversations is important.
And obviously recognizing that is the first step versus sort of putting your head in the sand. And we know that Suzanne highlighted the business case for this when it comes to things like racial disparities, saying that the US economy could be $8 trillion larger by 2050 if we eliminated racial disparities in areas such as health, education, incarceration, and employment. That information coming from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Talk about the business case for not just recruiting, but also retaining a workforce that doesn't just come in, but feels welcome and actually wants to stay.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, there's a lot of studies out there, and I could go on and on and on, right? But there's a lot of studies out there that show that your revenue grows in the amounts of 19 to 33% if you are able to retain and promote and, have these diverse individuals, especially in your leadership groups. Your market can grow also. Companies who are more diverse, especially in their leadership, see a growth of about 33,000 customers a year in comparison to only 22,000 customers a year if you have diversity at your leadership level. So that's huge. Some of the things as well, I prior to Allstate, I was at academic healthcare. And one of the things that I studied was around concordance. So what concordance means is the matching of race, gender, or language to your patient. So patient-provider concordance, right? I identify as Filipina. I've never had a Filipina provider, never. I'm in my early 40s, and I've never had a Filipina provider. Can you believe that? And that's not good, right? I can imagine, this is a really diverse room, I can imagine that if you see somebody who looks like you just be real, you automatically are like, I trust you. Like, you're good, right? Your parents look like me, like we ate the same food, we grew up in the same, just automatically as humans, we go to those and we trust those that look like us, right? In the field of safety and protection, which is what my field is in, that's important to us, right? You feel the most safe, you feel the most protected when people look like you, act like you, come from places like you. That's just an intrinsic human value, okay? And so we believe in that. And so that's why we feel it's really, really important, to have that at our highest, levels.
And when you're trying to show the value of DEI to your key stakeholders, not just employees, but shareholders, customers, how do you do that? How do you really quantify that value for them?
Yeah, so we look at, of course, we look at loyalty, how many years our customers have been with us. We look at referral rates we consider our employees also to be, our consumers. So again, of course, retention. I will tell you, in all honesty, retention is also hard in this environment because many people will stay at a company right now, given the economic environment, because it is difficult, to keep moving in kind of a recessionary environment. But we also look at things like engagement scores, asking questions specifically about would you refer Allstate to a friend or family? We also cut all of our employee data by demographics so that we're really honest with ourselves to say, compared to our majority population, whether it's white or male or white males, how is everyone else, kind of doing, right? So we're really using data to look and see whether we're being honest, with ourselves.
Obviously, we've had a number of turning points over the last few years. You had 2020, you had George Floyd.
Yeah.
And we saw a lot of companies making a lot of promises. Some ended up being performative. Others were sort of wondering, what do we actually see now? So when you think of how you would like companies to use these sorts of moments and how Allstate used these sorts of moments perhaps as a wake-up call, what do you think you would like other companies to do, having seen this, so that they're not seen as performative, but actually really making some changes that actually stick and make a difference?
Yeah. So let me tell you, I joined Allstate only a year and a half ago, less than a year and a half ago. I promised myself in my career I would never join a company as their head of diversity after a crisis. I told myself I would never. And here I am, I did it. Dang it. But here's the thing also that I really believe, for those of you who lead diversity efforts or help to support diversity efforts, we in the diversity field, you are the smartest if you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And I am by no means trying to disrespect the Black Lives Matter movement or the death of George Floyd. But that was a moment for our country, that was a moment for our world. It would be horrible to not leverage that opportunity or optimize on that opportunity to actually elevate conversations, right? So that's one of the reasons why when Allstate came and talked to me, I was like, you know what? I told myself I would never do this, but yeah, I'll come over and I'll join at this time. So, so one thing is be really smart about a couple things. Know what your company's identity around diversity is. Procter & Gamble did a really nice job about saying unapologetically, we will talk about Black lives, we'll talk about Black beauty, we'll talk about Black wealth. They unapologetically chose that as their identity of their diversity identity. Target does a really nice job around multicultural families and kiddos with disabilities. Unapologetically, they stay in that space. So what happens is when crisis occurs or when the world falls apart, they stay in that space because they have unapologetically chosen that as their identity. If a company hasn't done that, then what happens is when things fall apart, you're like, yeah, okay, we'll give money over here, we'll go over here, yeah. And then what happens is you play oppression Olympics. That is really rough on an organization, and it is at a high risk for an organization. At Allstate, we have chosen to be a part of the Black Lives Matter push, the idea of supporting African American and Black jobs and the provision of wealth, the disparity of wealth for women, and we're working on other disparities around people with disabilities and veterans. We have unapologetically chosen that as our identity. Will we get pushback? Of course we will, but a company I would encourage you to stand in your identity, figure out what that is, figure out how that is complementary and adjacent to your brand, and then go. We've talked about be intentional about what you're doing.
And I know we're running out of time. I just do quickly want to add about the Second Chance program as we look at 2 open jobs for every person who's able to work in this country. If you could just quickly tell us about the Second Chance program and what that actually does to a workforce.
Yeah, the Second Chance program, for those of you, we talked about it earlier, is essentially a recidivism program. So this idea of looking at individuals who have a background either in jail, prison, or a felony, and thinking about that. So many of you already know, so Allstate is part of the finance and insurance industry. Historically, the finance and insurance industry does not allow individuals with felonies or prison backgrounds into our workplace. And Allstate said, why not? I mean, why not? We have this rule, but certainly there would be opportunities for us, to look at individuals like this. And so we're actually folding that into the way that we're thinking about our work. Allstate is moving more towards a capabilities-based model. 87% of our jobs do not require, 87% of our jobs do not require a bachelor's degree. We are in a unique position as Allstate to look at capabilities-based hiring and capabilities-based promotions, and recidivism programs are a part of that.
I know we'll have to leave it there, but it's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.